Hi, good morning, and welcome to the ZP Developer Zone. So we do this webinar every Thursday at 8 a.m. London time, and we do it really to answer sort of technical questions that come in during the week, and we like to sort of address them in this webinar format. First thing I want to do is just make sure that the sound is coming through, which it is. Um, what it is today that we're doing a workshop this week. So suppose I should sort of transition to the next slide and say that we have this ZP Developer Zone and we have a free academy. People can go into that, or there's a couple of free courses in that academy, which is great. We do this free webinar once a week. So technical questions like limit of detection, etc. We bring them here. We have collaborations. Now collaborations are strictly speaking, I would describe more with academia. Um, Obviously, we post jobs, we have our ZP Developer Zone, and we have our workshops. So what's happening this week is we are doing a workshop in Norway. Hence, the background behind me has changed quite a bit. And I essentially work at a very small desk on a very bad Wi-Fi. So my apologies for that. Um, so we do these workshops, hence why this sort of changed today. I've also started this webinar much earlier than otherwise scheduled. It's about an hour and a half early. And as I say, when we have these workshops, it does sort of slightly change the dynamic, and I have to sort of jump in and make sure that I can do this webinar and then do the workshop. So anyway, any kind of links that you see today, you will find those links already underneath the video. Any kind of video quality, I also apologize. It's one of these hotel Wi-Fi, so I'll try and move on with that. But anyway, links are underneath the video already. So we are doing a workshop this week. I think this workshop is super useful for anyone doing wearable sensors, CGM sensors, in vitro diagnostics, the manufacturing of vitro diagnostics. So we do a very comprehensive 2-day workshop. This one is 8th and 9th of February, hence it's the 9th of February today. And I also want to say that we're doing another one in March. So though I will answer questions today, if you really want to dig a bit deeper, I would definitely suggest that you come along to these particular workshops. That said, let's go forward a little bit more. And we're even going to cover things like smart wound care, wearables, IVDs, all in these workshops, and glucose strips in particular. Not in particular, but glucose strips are also covered. So question number one today, if you see your question, then you'll know that I'll be answering it at some point in this webinar today. Somebody wants to know the difference between our pH sensors. Some have chloride resilient electrodes, some don't. I'll discuss that very quickly. Screen printed electrodes, whether to use a silver chloride or platinum auxiliary counter electrode. Quick answer is I would absolutely recommend the silver chloride, and I'll give you a bit more detail on that. Whether we do our glucose and lactate sterilized. I also want to say that we've just done a big batch of lactate sensors and manufacturing, so that actually you should see on the web store that we'll do them in smaller volumes now. So what I want to say here is about the sterilization of glucose and lactate sensors. I'll discuss that. Question number 4 is around potassium sensors. So this potassium sensor is originally developed for the idea that there's a lot of movement in the UK at the moment for home testing, point of care testing, and the potassium sensor really falls into that category. And it's one of the sensors that we've had actually the longest. We will talk about protein detection using antibodies. So if somebody wants to detect a protein, then a good way of doing that is actually, of course, to use a antibody. And we will discuss that today. And I also will talk about quality control in SMBGs, self-monitoring blood glucose. These are the sort of glucose strips. Talk about quality control there. The commercial landscape, or why is there sort of a lack of commercial landscape for organic transistors, or these organic conducting transistors? I'll discuss that. Just a quick comment about magnetic particles. I really quite like magnetic particles. I have seen them used really well. I think it's a nice technique for bringing samples to the electrode. I'll talk about somebody's interested in a whole slew of biosensors and their limit of detections, so I will discuss that. Also, electrodes parallel to the direction of flow. That's quite straightforward. To be honest with you, we could do this kind of stuff by 3D printing. Measurement of capsaicin. This is like an ongoing conversation. I think we're actually going to end up holding some workshops, online and in-person workshops, numbers and statistics for food technologists, and also workshops on our food sense technology. Recommendation on a screen printed electrodes. Also, this is kind of linked to question number 9. Question number 9 also involves troponin I, and question number 13 also involves troponin I as well. It's probably worth saying now that troponin I is something that we, it's only a assay or a method that we do with sort of larger clients, if I can say. And it's also question number 14 was about whether a USB potentiostat can apply 5 volts, and I will answer that. So it's probably worth saying there's a lot to cover today, and I have started quite early, like I say, because A, we've got the workshop today, and B, actually 14 questions. It's an awful lot. So in some of our sensors, we have, for example, the pH sensor, we have, this is what the pH sensor looks like. Some of them have a extra layer on the reference electrode, which then defines it as a chloride resilient electrode. Now, the chloride resilient electrode exists because some applications like urine, the chloride is actually unknown or variable, and we want to remove it from the signal, at which point then we think it's a good idea to use a chloride resilient electrode where we've actually fixed chloride onto that electrode. But if you're doing lab testing and in buffers, I would honestly just go for the simpler system, which is pH. Chloride resilient electrode, it works well when we're on a project with people, but there's a real nuance to chloride resilient because it's resilient for a certain amount of time, and that amount of time really depends on the application, on the chloride that we put into that reference electrode, and the chloride that you have in the sample. My recommendation is just go for the non-chloride resilient, but I want you to know that it exists because in some applications, like the pH of urine would be a good one, that chloride may not be super defined. So what I will now do is just shift forward slightly with question number 2. So question number 2 is, the question is really asking, should I have, this is one of our hypervalue electrodes. If the link pops up, then I will have already put the link underneath the video. But should they be using an auxiliary or a counter electrode that's platinum, or an auxiliary electrode that's silver chloride? And so the hypervalue has a carbon work electrode, which is good. It has a reference electrode, which is silver chloride. And then the auxiliary or counter electrode is also silver chloride. The problem with platinum is you don't know what that platinum is electrode. When the working electrode is doing an oxidation, the platinum electrode is doing a reduction. And when the working electrode is doing a reduction, the platinum electrode is doing oxidation. The question is, you don't know what it's actually doing. And so when you have a small volume on a screen printed electrode, for example, material, and especially in an IVD, in an in vitro diagnostic application, material can be diffusing from the counter auxiliary electrode to the working electrode. And I've actually seen that where you essentially get chemical crosstalk, because you don't, whatever you are producing is often it's often in solution, it's often able to diffuse across, and because the distances are quite small, then it takes about 15 seconds for that material to diffuse across, and then you start getting sort of weird phenomena on your working electrode. But when we make the electrode out of silver chloride, then if we oxidize the the counter electrode, then silver becomes silver chloride, which is insoluble and it stays where it is. And if we do reduction, silver chloride becomes silver, which is also insoluble and stays there. So there's a real advantage in terms of analyzing small samples and not getting crosstalk between the working and auxiliary electrode. And also, I'll mention it in about question 14, but I've had companies that make these kind of USB powered potentiostats, and they like this electrode because the counter electrode is silicon chloride. It demands a very what's called a compliance voltage, a very small compliance voltage. So this electrode can actually be used with USB potentiostats that, for example, a platinum counter electrode would not be able to, because those little potentiostats can't apply large compliance voltages. So I did have one of the manufacturers tell me of a USB potentiostat, said that he loved the hypervalue electrodes with their silver chloride counter electrode because it allowed him to use it allowed their USB potentiostats to work properly, because the counter electrode being silver chloride allowed for a lower compliance voltage. So that's just a sort of side comment and a bit of an anecdote. Question number 3. Oh, this is still question number 2, that because they're actually trying to transition from a glassy carbon electrode to a carbon electrode. I am a big fan of that transition because I always feel that glassy carbon electrodes, especially when you're doing IVD development, they're in no way reflecting what the final product is going to look like. So you can spend 3 years doing a PhD on a glassy carbon electrode. The form factor's all wrong, the material's wrong, the volume size in your assays is all wrong. So I do agree that people need to get onto screen printed electrodes if they're intending to sort of go in a point of care test or rapid diagnostic test IVD direction. Somebody also wants to know if our the glucose and lactate sensor that we sell on the website, by standard they are not sterilized, but we do sterilize them when we're working with clients. So we have some clients across the globe, we're doing projects with them, and there we do sterilize. I just want to put the nuance to that answer, and the nuance is that we do manufacture in aseptic conditions. So we do a bioburden test on the manufacturing environment, and this one in particular we basically record it at a 0 CFU per mil, but it just means we're below the limit of detection. So we do aseptic manufacturing, but the products that we put on the web store have not then been sterilized. It adds cost, and we only do it really when we're on projects with clients. Question number 4 is around potassium sensing. So potassium sensing is, I say, one of the things that we've been doing for the longest time. I sort of say here that this potassium sensor is almost our generation 1. It can work with 50 to 30 microliters, which is really a sort of drop of blood. We have done potassium sensors in capillary, at which point our standard capillary will go down to like 4 microliters, which is really a drop of blood, but could actually go a lot smaller. Now we do have a generation 3 potassium sensor coming, but we only release this with people who are doing projects with us or programs with us. So you can buy generation 1, for example, on the website, but we also have a generation 3. If funding and budget is a restriction for you, you can also make your own, and I'll just discuss that here, that we have the potassium activation solution. There's a video on the website. Hopefully I've linked to all of this. You can also use our hypervalue electrodes. So you can buy a sheet of hypervalue electrodes, $145, which gives you, I think, approximately 300. So it's not that actually high cost to actually produce your own. The only thing I want to say there is here's some links. If you do produce your own, you have to support yourself unless you're purchasing engineering services from Zimmer and Peacock. So this on potassium, there's kind of several ways forward. At least 2 of them are you can just purchase off the web store. You can actually make your own by using materials off the web store, but be careful if you do it yourself, because you'll have to purchase engineering support of Zimmer and Peacock if you essentially get stuck. I also think it's a good idea. We did actually yesterday, we did our workshop. As I say, it's a 2-day workshop that's running at the moment. We did our workshop yesterday, and actually we tested a potassium sensor, and it was absolutely beautiful. Right, question number 5, proteins detected using antibodies. These are some slides that I put up in the past, but we have published in the academic. This is one of the first papers we did actually when Zimmer Peacock first came along. Take one of our hypervalue electrodes. This is called pyrene, I think, NHS. So there's 4 aromatic rings on this molecule. They pi bond to the electrode really well. This is an NHS group. It's very active. And essentially, it's almost like what we call click chemistry, that these antibodies can then be attached to the surface. And then you can either block with BSA or maybe chitosan. And so that's really as simple as it gets, that you can actually just take one of our... The nice thing about the hypervalue electrodes is, I'll talk about this in our manufacturing section. So I hope you watch the whole, let's say, webinar today, because I'm going to show you that our hypervalue electrodes, or many of our electrodes, have a coefficient of variation or a relative standard deviation of like 4% or less. They're really, and if that means that actually you can get some work done, otherwise you're dealing with an electrode that's so variable, your signal is essentially hidden because of the variability in the electrodes that you're trying to test upon. Anyway, when we're doing this kind of work, we often follow the progression of our functionalization using something like cyclovoltammetry. That is something that we do cover in our workshops as well. And then we do a testing phase. Somebody in part of this webinar is asking about square wave voltammetry. In this particular example, we're actually using differential pulse voltammetry, where as the protein binds, the signal in this case was increasing. And this is quite unusual, because with an assay like this, you'd almost call it a blocking assay, and the signal should theoretically decrease. But sometimes a blocking assay, the signal can increase, and that's because there's some sort of electrostatic favorable interaction that's happening when you're binding. So in this particular paper, we were using kind of ferricyanide, which is negatively charged, and it seemed when binding took place, there was some electrostatic repulsion that was keeping the ferricyanide from the surface essentially decreased, and actually the signal went up. So it was a little bit counterintuitive, but we did manage to explain it to the I was going to say examiner, but to the assessor, and they accepted our explanation, and it was published. So the quick answer is, of course, I would recommend our hypervalue carbon electrodes, but at the same time, I will show you today some data which shows that they're really excellent. I say it a lot, and Aftab, one of our guys, or an excellent guy in India who sells ZP products there, he hears me say this ad nausea, but the biggest consumer of ZP screen-printed electrodes is Zimmer Peacock, and that means that we really care about the quality. We use a lot of those hypervalue carbon electrodes. We care about the quality, and therefore what we're shipping is really quite high quality. I will move on with that. If you're doing this kind of work where you're trying to detect a protein and antibody, now Zimmer Peacock, we do this a lot, so all our scientists are really trained up on this kind of work. I just want to kind of warn you that you're talking about at least 111, I should say it here, at least 111 hours. So this is like us making a antibody sensor. There's 3 sensors here, 3 sensors here, 3 sensors here, 3 sensors here, and 3 sensors here. So you can see that, yeah, in our limit of detection, we start getting the most spread, but as we get more and more concentrated, of course, the signal becomes clearer. You don't even realize there's 3 electrodes underneath there. But I'm just trying to say that that data is not even perfect, and it takes 111 hours. So, you've got to be reasonable what you can actually achieve in academic research, especially in things like master's projects or bachelor projects. I've got quite a few slides on this now. So what I'm going to talk about now is methods, strategies around the quality control in, for example, developing an IVD and in vitro diagnostic, and I'll be thinking a lot about glucose strips today in particular. So the general workflow is that we'll have some IQC, incoming quality control. That will be the enzyme activity. If the electrodes have been screen printed elsewhere, what are those electrodes like? We obviously screen print our own electrodes. Then you've got the manufacturing QC. So for example, I'm going to put down enzyme onto that surface. Did I do that in a repeatable fashion? OQC, having put the laminates down and made the capillary chamber, did I do that in a repeatable manner? Now we can control all this through Julie. So Julie will allow us, for example, to collect 1,000 test points or data points, and then actually just crunch them really quickly. I mean, it is important to have this kind of IT capability, which we're really good at. Overview. So if I was thinking about a glucose strip, if you're not currently manufacturing the screen printed electrodes, then you have to do an IQC on that. There's analytical methods, and then there's testing high throughput methods, and I'll sort of discuss that. I'll discuss in particular at ZP, we do a lot of electrochemical characterization, which I think is actually the best way, essentially, of characterizing an electrode. And I'll talk about all the different methods, and I'll dig into that a bit more. What's nice is because we put the data through Julie, it will actually give us a report or a document at the end of it. So actually we can just sign it. So it can be part of our QMS, our quality management system. So Julie is not just a database for crunching data. It also will then allow you to download a report with a signature box, so it can be part of the quality system, and that's what we use. There's a functionalization step. So you may have to do QC after the functionalization step. So for example, you deposit out GDH, FAD, maybe some ferricyanide as the sort of mediator. And it could also be a reference electrode material as well, some trehalose to help protect the enzyme. That active material gets essentially printed down, and then you have to do some QC on that. Again, we can actually, the difference in the QC here is that we will do some functional testing at ZP. We would do like a low, medium, and high, for example, glucose measurement, but not just one or two, as you could appreciate, quite a lot. And they will have to go through Julie, because then I'll show you in a bit that Julie can just crunch that data, process that data very quickly. There's also the point that you might actually then laminate it and turn it into a sort of true microfluidic device here. And there might be some OQC, outgoing quality control, involved with that. We also may do some functional testing at that stage as well. I think the longer manufacturing goes on, whether you do functional testing before or after lamination, I think in the end you want to do it after lamination, but you do more testing at the beginning of a manufacturing. As you develop manufacturing, you tend to do more testing, and with time you can then rationalize how much testing you actually do. Talking about IQC, so let's say there was some materials were coming in and the electrodes were coming in from elsewhere. The IQC that you could do is electrical testing. I have a slide on it. You can do profilometry. I have a slide on it. Visual inspection. I have a slide on this. And electrochemical functional testing, and I do have a slide on this as well. Electrodes. When it comes to electrical testing, I mean, it's one of the easiest things to do. Everyone does it. What they don't tell you is it's a surrogate for doing other testing. It sort of works. So we'll test along these conductive tracks, make sure that they're within some sort of specification, so it's easy to do, so people do it. It's easy to automate. You can just come down with a reader, a bunch of what are called pogo pins or bed of nails, and make electrical contact and read them. It's useful for spotting gross problems, so it'll spot open circuits, i.e. the track has actually got a break in it. It'll spot short circuits, tracks that are actually connected to one another that shouldn't be connected to one another, and it will spot gross resistance problems. So if the tracks are made of the wrong carbon ink and the resistance changes from 1 ohm to 1,000 ohms, obviously spot that kind of grossness. It's got limited surface characterization, so there's a critical surface in SMBGs, and that's the surface between, let's say, the carbon electrode and the solution, and it tells you nothing about that critical surface. And I would also say it's superseded by electrochemical testing. So the information that you would get out of electrical testing, you actually get it out of the electrochemical testing. So it's almost like I recommend you do electrochemical testing, because actually it does electrical testing anyway when you do that test. Profilimetry, this is a kind of analytical technique and not something that you can really implement in as a quality control tool. So we do profilimetry. We do it for clients. It's fairly easy to do. The machines are kind of well set up. Useful for spotting gross errors. There's some use in it. Limited surface characterization. It tells you the roughness of the surface characterization. It tells you the thickness of the print. It's useful, but I actually consider it not critical. And again, I think this is actually superseded by electrochemical testing. What profilimetry ends up telling you is a lot about the surface, but you can find out a lot about the surface by doing electrochemical characterization. So people use profilimetry because basically they understand it, but it's never going to be high throughput. So you can use it to understand your print thickness, but I wouldn't be over reliant on this. Visual inspection. I mean, visual inspection. This is we have a visual inspection system. Take a picture of a sheet of electrodes, put it through Julie. It's not very. Julie has an AI and an image inspector, and it can basically look at that and say, okay, well, those are grossly wrong, which is clear to your eye. But it sort of turns the subjective into objective. So we automate that. So visual inspection is easy to do, easy to automate. It has no surface characterization, but it's one that I would actually say you should do because it's so obvious. You should visually inspect something. I mean, you just look at that sheet and you can see the bad electrodes. So that one I would say is worth doing, just because it's so easy. Now, electrochemical functional testing. So I mentioned electrical testing and profilimetry, and I actually said that they're sort of superseded or trumped by this testing. It's probably worth saying that at ZP, if we're doing quality control, we obviously want to be testing large numbers of electrodes, and therefore we need to be testing essentially in parallel. So we do actually have a parallel instrument. You can see the back side of it here. This particular instrument allows us to test something like 6 electrodes at the same time. It's probably worth saying that we actually have jigs where we don't need to singulate every single electrode. We can actually test rows, for example. And in fact, when we're testing sheets, we don't even singulate. We actually come in with a special head and actually read unsingulated sheets. But it's probably worth saying that we do test everything in parallel because time is literally money and we can't be doing this one at a time. So we do have a nice parallel instrument that allows us to test 6 at a time. But because it's essentially so small, it also allows us to have 2 or 3 or 4 instruments so we can really increase the test throughput. So that's a little parallel potentiostat that we have. So we are testing a minimum of 6 at a time, more likely 12 at a time. So we can sort of essentially get enough data to make statistical analysis on this. So Julie does this automatically, by the way, but I talk about this a lot in our workshop. So and I talk about that, cyclophotometry, there's an over-reliance that people make on cyclophotometry, but I actually think it's not bad as a quality control tool, as long as you understand it well enough. But Julie can also help you. Julie's this online database that we have. Anyone can open an account with it. So we gather the data, and we would, for example, look at the peak heights. The peak heights will help us know what's the print thickness, what's the print roughness, what's the print area, and it will also tell us something about the conductive tracks as well. So I said that profilimetry and electrical resistance testing was sort of superseded by electrochemical testing, and it's because actually much of those parameters, we can see it in the cyclovoltammetry essentially. There's also peak position, and peak position will also change if I have very poorly conducting tracks. If I have no conductivity in those tracks, I get no peaks. If I have highly conductive tracks, my peaks are in one position, but as those tracks become more and more resistive, the peaks come apart from one another. So we can interpret from the peak height and the peak position a lot of quality parameters around a printed electrode. And importantly, because we're doing that at mass, we can actually do, repeatability testing. But that's why you really need Julie. This is quite a nice example here. There's, a whole bunch of CVs that we've measured. The shaded bar says that Julie's looking in that shaded area and is analyzing, and I'll dig into that a little bit more. I did mention earlier on that I really recommend, of course, I'm going to recommend our own hypervalue electrode, especially to that R&D community. It's probably worth saying that our relative standard deviation or coefficient of variation is about 4%, which you sort of need in things like glucose sensors. As I say, coefficient of variation or RSD is about 4% on those. Now, what we've done here is this is another analysis of some cyclophotometry that we would have obtained in the quality stages, but we're actually analyzing both the oxidation and reduction peak here. And what we are able to do then in Julie, this is specifically in Julie, so you don't need to have experts in electrochemistry to necessarily interpret the data. We've set a sort of pass criteria, and then this one's based on peak-to-peak separation. So if there's a sort of peak, I would suspect that you need, for example, conductive tracks that have a certain conductivity. That will be seen in our peak-to-peak separation, and we can set a criteria on that, and the software will automatically check for that. We can also have another criteria set on peak height. Peak height tells us about really the print area, the print roughness, the print thickness. We can set a criteria based on that, and we can check that. And what these electrochemical methods are doing is it's really telling us a lot of the things about print and a lot of things about conductivity of tracks, but it's then also telling us this critical interface between the electrode and the liquid. And none of the other methods really do that. And the nice thing is, if there's also gross issues, this is, by the way, silver contamination of the working electrode. That's a gross issue. This is a very poorly conducting track. We'll just see it straight away, and that can be rejected. But you won't necessarily see that silver contamination by even visual inspection, and you definitely wouldn't see the poor conductive track by visual inspection. But we can pick them up by electrochemistry. Something that Julie does as well is if you have a sheet like this, we're able to go in there and electrochemically test it. We're actually then able to bring a map out of that and actually spot, let's say there's an electrode in that sheet that's out of family with all the other ones. Julie will produce you a report, and you can spot the bad electrodes. Sometimes you can find clusters of bad electrodes, and that tells you something about the printing process. So Julie has really nice analytics for that kind of work as well. And we can also look at this is what we do, obviously, look at sheets at the beginning, middle, and end of a run, and we can understand how the performance is changing during the run. So that's something that Julie does. There's another big important stage is QC functionalization. Everything I've talked about so far has almost been like an IQC, incoming quality control. So now I'm going to talk about QC functionalization. So, we have our multi-channel potentiostats. We're able to test at scale. Now there's a point where you actually put down, or you deposit down if it was a glucose sensor, GDH, FAD, some ferricyanides, some excipients like trehalose, and some sugars, some buffers, salts to control pH. You might also do it at the later stage where you've actually got the capillary in place. This time we would actually test at sort of low, medium, high concentrations. What I'm describing actually gets us to the raw signal. Sometimes when people are doing testing, they're testing on a glucose meter, for example, and getting a glucose number. It's kind of useless because you don't see the raw signal, and so you can't troubleshoot readily. But the way we do it in the equipment we have, actually we can test at different concentrations. So here actually this is all data that's in Julie, and what's happening is Julie's going in there. It's actually finding those numbers itself and plotting those numbers itself. So no spreadsheets, no errors by quality control guys. It all just gets automated, and immediately for this batch, I can see our limit of blank, our limit of detection, our limit of quantification. you know, we can see our R squared values, etc. So it just your guys essentially manually, well, your guys do the test, but they don't do the interpretation, and it sort of makes the whole thing much more objective. And of course, we can produce all this as a report straight out of Julie. And we would do the same through a run, you know, make sure that everything was staying within spec during a functional run. Right, question number 7. Don't forget there's 14 questions today. I think these questions actually get shorter as we go along. As I say, I apologize I've had to start this webinar early. But question number 7 is about OECTs, OECTSs. These are sort of organic transistors. And the question there is really asking why are there sort of not many, if any, commercial examples of their exploitation. And the reason being is that there's so many biosensor modalities. This is just one of so many biosensor modalities. And sometimes you have to ask yourself the question, there's a new biosensor modality out there, there's a new way of measuring biology or chemistry, but what's the problem that it's solving? So it's really one of competition here that, you know, if I wanted to detect a biomolecule, I could use absorption spectroscopy, I could use fluorescence spectroscopy, I could use colorimetry in terms of like lateral flow strips, surface plasma resonance, SPR, that's used quite a bit, biofets, field effect transistors, which then confuses people because we're talking about OECTSs, GFETs. There's a lot, and then there's electrochemical sensing that we do. So even when you look at electrochemical sensing, there's amperometry, voltammetry. If you say voltammetry, square wave voltammetry, differential pulse voltammetry, normal pulse voltammetry, EIS, electrochemical impedance spectroscopy, or sometimes called dielectric impedance spectroscopy, potentiometry. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that when you've got a new technology, especially in the world of biosensing, you're falling into a community or group of technologies. There's already lots of technology. I haven't even talked about quartz crystal microbalance, surface acoustic waves, so many modalities that if you develop something new, unless it's really spectacular, and everyone thinks that new technology is spectacular, you know, that's just what, you know, every inventor thinks theirs is the best. It's just human nature. So it's really distracting, actually, how much is really going on in here. So what's the biggest selling biosensor in the world is probably the glucose strip. They're all electrochemical. So electrochemistry has kind of been pulling ahead. What's the most measured chemical parameter in the world? pH. How is that measured mostly? It's mostly measured on potentiometric sensors. A glass pH electrode is a potentiometric electrode. So I think people are, rather than developing new modalities of testing, like, you know, new GFETs, new biofets, new OECTSs, I'd actually say work on the applications. Now, I think arrays of transistor-based sensors, actually, that when you have the transistors in an array so that you can have spatial measurement or spatial resolution, that is actually interesting. So one transistor on its own measuring one analyte in blood is not super interesting. But when you make arrays so that you can monitor the pH across, for example, a solution, that actually is interesting. And that's when transistor technology actually comes into its own. But in general, just one transistor measuring one sample in what, you know, is, or one analyte in one sample is not super interesting. It can be done by many ways. If I was making a transistor type technology, I think I would be playing with the array, the ability that, you know, if you're using CMOS type fabrication, you can actually produce arrays of these things in very high density. And that's what's actually interesting. So why has there not been an exploitation of it? I've actually known companies that have tried to exploit these organic materials. They just didn't make it. But you need, you know, in order to have a successful technology, sometimes you need something like, you know, 10, 100 companies all trying it. But of course, there's so many technologies out there that the 100 companies are all probably using different technologies. And so for OECTS to actually make it to commercialization, it's just a probability that it's, you know, unless you do it yourself, you can't rely on other people to do it for you. What I find interesting about transistor type technologies is they often look at current versus voltage. Well, current versus voltage is called voltammetry. And then they sometimes look at what they call different gate voltages, where they change the voltage. That strikes me as something like amperometry. So people think there's a big disconnect between OECTSs and electrochemical sensors. There's not a big disconnect. These are really, we're actually all playing in the same realm. We're calling it different things, but I can understand these kind of graphs because one of these graphs looks like voltammetry and the other one looks like amperometry to me. If people are interested in diving into that a little bit deeper, I'll be happy to do it. But with 14 questions today, I have to sort of skip and go forward. So come to one of our workshops, we talk about amperometry, we talk about voltammetry, we talk about potentiometry, we talk about impedance spectroscopy. I mean, it's probably worth saying that, people come to our workshops, we've got somebody coming, hopefully from UAE, the Arab Emirates, for the next workshop as well. So people are coming from all over the world. And all of these, let's say, methods can all be applied using very small potentiostats these days. This is one of our single-purpose biosensors circuits from Zimmer and Peacock. I will move forward a little bit quicker, and like I say, my apologies for starting this workshop early, not workshop, but this webinar early today. Somebody is interested in taking magnetic beads, using biotin to attach DNA probes. The streptavidin will be on the magnetic particle. The biotin, which will have the DNA essentially capture probe, will bind to the streptavidin. So, of course, I would recommend, especially if we're going to do square wave voltammetry, doing it on one of our hypervalue electrodes. I mean, I talked about 4% coefficient of variation earlier on, so hopefully you'll see that. I think this is, I actually quite like magnetic particles. I've seen it done in quite a few assays, and I think it works actually. So I can see that you want to put your DNA capture probe on there. I think that's a good idea. Then you're going to end up possibly capturing the strand of DNA that you're actually interested in, and then you can put a tag on that. When I say tag, see, that could be it could be a ferrocene tag. There was a company in the UK that was kind of doing something with silver nanoparticles, and at which point then you can obviously, now I'm not going to say I'm the world's expert on magnetic particles. In general, in my experience so far, things of the kind of range of magnetic particles seem to be in 600 to about 600 nanometers to about 10 micrometers. But I suppose the size of particle that you end up going to be using could be slightly dependent on what you're actually trying to detect as well. But this range is the kind of range that I see being used on commercial projects. So I hope that kind of helps. I do like the idea that you take the electrodes, you obviously have everything in the bulk, you bring a magnet down, and it brings everything down to the surface. And that's literally what I've seen happen, and I think it works really quite well. And I have seen people then use linear sweep voltammetry. You want to do square wave voltammetry. I agree, square wave voltammetry is a nice sensitive technique. You might as well try differential pulse voltammetry while you're at it as well. I think there's a slightly simpler assay where you just capture your probe, your DNA target, let's say, and you bring that to the surface. And in your buffer, you have, for example, something like ferricyanide. This is a slightly simpler assay, and I think this might also work as well. So you might as well give that a try as well. So what's the detection limit? This is question 9. What's the detection limit of our pH? Our pH, our oxygen sensor, sodium sensor, potassium sensor, our lactate sensor, our glucose sensor, hydroperoxide, and also our troponin sensor. It's also worth saying that the troponin sensor appears in a slightly later question as well. So question 9 is there's a sort of, I wouldn't say much of a repetition, but some more comments later on. Limit detection or pH sensing is really interesting because pH doesn't have a sort of standard limit detection. 0 pH is pH 7. It's very easy for us to detect pH 7, let's say. So I think it's a slightly wrong question. I mean, our sensors work at pH 7, pH 10, pH 4. I think we've gone to pH 2. So we have quite a range on our pH sensors. So I don't think the question, the pH of 0, as I say, is actually, oh, pH 0 protons is essentially pH 7, which is neutral, and that's well within our test. Oxygen, what's our limit of detection? It's a tricky one for me to answer. We do actually construct and test an oxygen sensor as part of our workshop, so you can get to do this experiment for real. But the way it's happening, see, this is 100% oxygen saturated, and then this is 0%. I mean, there's a clear signal between us, but our limit of detection is really kind of application dependent. If it was in a bioreactor, that's one thing. If it was in a wearable with the extra noise in a wearable, there'd be another thing. But we have a strong signal, but I can't absolutely tell you what our limit of detection is on that. Sodium, we've tested it from 40 to 80 to 160 to 320 millimolar. This is a kind of, the typical clinical value for sodium is sometimes, I think, is about 130 millimolar. We've tested well either side of that with no problems. Potassium, I think people start worrying about potassium levels when it gets to about potassium 4 millimolar, and we've definitely been testing in that range. I think the potassium sensor appears earlier on in something like question 4. So people can access our potassium sensor and just do it for themselves. But if you do it for yourself, just know you are doing it on your own. Lactate sensors, again, this is really something that we have to do on projects, but we are testing. We can clearly see the difference between 0 and 1, so limit of detection is really not a big issue for us on lactate. Glucose, glucose is the projects that we do, or one of the sensors we've done the most on. And, when you look at our clinical range, we're testing at 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, millimolar. So, if our limit of detection, we can easily differentiate between 0 and 1, for example. The reason I bring up that is in the clinical applications, 0 is 0 millimolar is essentially you never see it because that person would be dead. But the idea that we can resolve 0 and 1 millimolar, really no problems. Hydrogen peroxide, our limit detection is somewhere less than 0.5 micromolar. This is some data that I pulled off the website. What's the detection limit of troponin? So this is actually, we've obviously got a troponin sensor up there. We only do the troponin sensor with clients that we're in projects with. We deliberately, in fact, yeah. But that's 10 picograms per mil, and then at the extreme range here, it's about 100,000 picograms per mil. I'm not absolutely sure on the limit detection because we need more data in order to really quantify that limit detection. So here's some useful links. There's actually a troponin link that's also underneath the video, but I realize it's not there at that moment. Can we manufacture electrodes in a channel where the electrodes are perpendicular to the flow? And the answer is one of our standard flow cells. We have an in and we have an out, and the flow is perpendicular to the electrode. So the quick answer is yes, we can do that. Here's a couple of useful links. And here's also a couple of more useful links showing you that having electrodes perpendicular to flow is something that we do quite routinely. Question number 11, measuring capsaicin. It's probably worth saying that we've been doing videos on capsaicin now for a couple of weeks. So if you have an expected Scoville heat unit of, I say here 11,000, what I might just do very quickly actually is just change that to 110,000 and 210,000. So you have now the problem that we often face sometimes we face, not often, but sometimes we face in chili sensing is people receive these certificates of analysis from HPLC companies, but what you don't find is that there's no evidence of how they've calibrated or calculated those values. So if somebody makes an HPLC measurement of capsaicin, then at some point they have to have done a calibration on that HPLC. So when was that calibration done? Where's that data showing that calibration? If that calibration was done a few days ago, that's a problem. So people take those numbers and say, well, that's the truth. Is it the truth? I'm not entirely certain that it is. But let's say you had an expected and you had an actual, and we have talked about this of recent. So you have an HPLC system, and for example, the HPLC system is reading 64,000 Scoville heat units. First thing is you don't know that that's actually the truth. You have to take almost like the scientific method to that. And you record it on the food sensor 98,000. We can obviously adjust that by just putting a response factor of 0.65, and it moves. It forces the food sense to be in line with the HPLC. But it actually seems that the HPLC is correct, which is not actually necessarily the case. You could have another scenario, different spice, and in this scenario, maybe the spice is actually 110,000 Scoville units, and the food sense is reading 210,000 Scoville units. In that case, put a response factor of 0.5. What we're trying to do is people have an expectation that the HPLC is correct. HPLC is not necessarily correct. You've got to see people report, for example, numbers on those certificates of analysis. There's no error on that, and if their error is like plus or minus 30%, which it really could be, and they're not reporting that. So the response factor will allow you to, for different spices, if you've got an HPLC expectation, you want to be in line with that, then we can use the response factor to bring you in line. But it's making us match with the HPLC, but it assumes that the HPLC is actually correct. But unless you've seen how they do it, how they calibrate it, what their error is from their calibration, you can't really say that they are absolutely correct. You've no real evidence for it. Somebody wants to deposit their confidential material onto a screen printed electrode. Do we have any recommendations? The quick answer is, the biggest user of screen printed electrodes that Zimmer Peacock sells is Zimmer Peacock, so I would obviously recommend our hypervalue carbon electrode. An uncut sheet of hypervalue electrodes is like $145. If there's 300 on there, it's less than 50 cents each. So it means you can experiment and make mistakes, and it's not so expensive. Somebody's very interested in our Troponin eye sensor, things like the shelf life, storage conditions. So the Troponin eye, we will only discuss it and work with it as part of a project. So I have a couple of links here to our engineering and our proof of principle projects. This one, somebody wants to apply 5 volts to an electrode, and they're asking whether a USB potentiostat will actually do it. If you apply 5 volts to an electrode, you will automatically, you probably end up damaging the electrode, and you also end up doing hydrolysis of the water. So to split water, you have to apply something like 1 to 2 volts. 5 volts would absolutely annihilate water, so I'm not really sure that you can actually apply, strictly speaking, apply 5 volts. If you're in water, even if you were in organic solvents, I think you would actually, I don't know if you can actually apply 5 volts. So the quick answer is, I know that you say you want to apply 5 volts, but I don't think you can apply 5 volts. If you think you're applying 5 volts, then at those electrodes, there's so much hydrolysis and splitting, for example, of water or the solvent. It's probably just gassing, and gas streams are just coming off it. So I don't think you need 5 volts, but in order to, or you can apply 5 volts. But in order to answer your question, can a USB potentiostat do it? I've got links to all these little images below. The quick answer is these potentiostats, where you're sort of powering them off a USB, I'm pretty sure that they can't actually do it. I had a whole conversation earlier on about the hypervalue electrode and about compliance voltage, because we use the silver chloride, it helps with compliance voltage. So these USB potentiostats do best with our hypervalue electrode because of we really help them with their compliance voltage. But these types of potentiostats are actually quite low powered. So they look really elegant and, but to use them to do functionalization of electrodes, functionalization often requires a bit more power. I think they're underpowered for it, to be honest with you. So there's a multi-channel potentiostat earlier on that I would have actually recommended. So as I say, that the silver chloride counter would help this person, but this person wants to apply 5 volts. I'm not even sure that you can apply 5 volts because all you'll end up doing is damaging any electrodes, splitting the water. It's going to be a real mess. Secondly, that no, the electrodes probably don't. Sorry, not electrodes. The USB potentiostat do not have the power to do that. So there's a couple of useful links here if you do want a USB power potentiostat. But I think when it comes to functionalizing electrodes, I wouldn't use a low power USB potentiostat. You could use them for analytics, looking at analyte versus concentration, but you can't really use them for functionalization. They're too low powered. So question number 1, chloride resilient pH electrodes. So some of our electrodes have a fixed chloride concentration on them. If you're doing pH measurements, I'd start with the standard, don't go for the resilient one. Definitely go for silver chloride rather than platinum. Sterilization of glucose and lactate. Yes, we do it. We do it with commercial companies on sort of paid programs, but the ones that we do actually do aseptic manufacturing in a clean room as standard anyway. Potassium sensors, you can buy those potassium sensors. You can also make your own potassium sensors. So there's a few links underneath this video that could be useful to you. Protein detection using antibodies. Sure, take a hypervalued carbon electrode, use pyrene NHS. The pyrene NHS will give you a surface of NHS groups, which you can then link your antibody to. Quality control in SMBGs. Be careful with quality control in SMBGs. Many companies will lead you down the route of electrical testing, profilimetry, visual inspection, but nobody will properly take you down the route of electrochemical testing. And electrochemical testing then means that you didn't need to do that. Electrochemical testing means you don't have to do electrical testing and you don't have to do profilimetry. Commercial landscape of OECTs, it's basically just in competition with so many other modalities. I think it's better these days not to work on modality of testing, but actually to work on applications. There's enough sensing technologies out there. It's working on applications. That's the real that's the real thing that's going to help society. Magnetic particles, 600 to 10 micrometers is my experience. Biosensor starter kit. Just went through all the sensors. It's hard to answer those limit detection questions because limit detection is in part, we have the sensors, but the limit detection has to be assessed like in a total system, not as a sensor in its own. We can get great limit detection in vitro, but all hell breaks loose when you go in vivo or ex vivo. Electrodes parallel to the direction of flow. Yep, our standard flow cell does that. Measurement of capsaicin. Big problem with measurement of capsaicin, especially when people are comparing against HPLC, is that they're starting with the belief that the HPLC is accurate, but accuracy on the HPLC has to be proven. You have to understand how they're calibrating the HPLC. When did they last calibrate their HPLC? What's the error of measurement on their HPLC? Have you tested them by sending in the same sample over the course of 3 weeks and looking at the results? So you can't assume the truth just because it's printed on a sheet of paper. Recommendation on a screen printed electrode. Sure, go for a hypervalued carbon electrode. It's probably worth saying on the capsaicin, we're going to start doing some training courses. Troponin I, we have the Troponin I sensor. In this presentation, I've actually shown you that we have signal from 10 picograms per milliliter up to about 100,000 grams, or 100,000 picograms per milliliter. So I hope that gives a bit more insight into that sensor. And then finally, I don't think you can apply 5 volts to a working electrode. I think you're just going to absolutely blow apart the water or the solvent that you're in. And then secondly, those potentiostats, which are sort of USB powered, are, I think, too low power to actually do what you need to do. Your best chance, if you want to use a low cost, low power USB, is probably using a hypervalue electrodes. But I think you'd have to do this kind of modification more like 1 volt, but not 5 volts. And I think it's essentially thank you. So I apologize. That was something like 1 hour. We did go earlier than we were otherwise planning to do, but I had no choice. As I say, we have a workshop running today. I really hope some of you will come to our workshops. I think they essentially, it's a great way of meeting us, asking questions, getting a sense of the business. So I will leave it at that. But I will go and have breakfast now, and I hope you will have a very good day. Okay, thanks very much.